All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our very first community conversation, LGBTQ youth during the pandemic. So to start off, I guess we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. My name's Arushi Pant, and I'm a senior at Carnegie Vanguard High School, and I'm super passionate about LGBTQ rights, immigrant justice, racial justice, and other issues, and I am the founder and president of Spectrum, which is an online platform that advocates for the LGBTQ community and reports on issues that are relevant to LGBTQ youth.
Hi, my name is Evelina Torres. My pronouns are she, her. I go to Incarnate Word Academy. My interests are also in LGBT rights, immigrant rights, and racial equality. And that's my spiel.
My name is Cameron, and I use they, them pronouns, and I am a junior at Seven Lakes High School, and I'm so happy to be here.
All right, so just to kind of give us some context, we're going to talk more about what our conversation is about and what Shift Press as an organization is, so we have a better idea going forward. So basically, what our Shift Press community conversations are trying to do is help build a safe space by young people, for young people, to facilitate conversations about COVID-19 and its effects on the greater Houston area community. So us specifically, we'll be leading a youth-led discussion based on our personal experiences with how queer youth have been impacted by the pandemic. We're trying to create a really welcoming environment that connects our audience and organizers to get excited to do the groundwork with Houston organizations and other community members. So like I mentioned before, I do work with Spectrum, so getting connected to organizations like that are grassroots community organizations that advocate for different issues that we may be passionate about is what we're really here to do. So kind of before we go forward, I wanted to talk about some norms before Evelina kind of goes in and talks more about the issue at hand today. So in terms of norms, as always, make sure to respect everyone's opinions, even if you disagree throughout the conversation. Never invalidate people's personal stories or experiences. If someone says something has happened to them or they share something and they're being really vulnerable with it, it's really important to accept what they say and support them in the best way possible. And there's one person, one mic. So if someone is speaking, be sure to always keep yourself muted and not talk over them. Be kind to people, as always, and have an open mind. You might hear things or experience things that you've never experienced or heard of before. And it's really important to stay open about these things and be open to changing your own mind and having some new perspectives on different issues. And now Evelina can go ahead and talk about specifically what we'll be talking about today, which is queer youth during the pandemic.
Yes. So as we know, this pandemic has brought a lot of changes to all of our lives in so many more aspects than we could have ever imagined. Being at home, it has brought on many different challenges for a variety of people, and some of which are queer youth. Being at home means that we no longer have certain resources that we once had. It means that we no longer are able to easily contact previous social groups that we were really have a strong connection with, because it is a different experience being a queer youth. So it's definitely important for us to have those connections. And ever since this pandemic, it has become more of a struggle for many queer youth, and even struggling with variations of homelessness and homophobic households have become an issue in the community as well.
Here, I also wanted to bring up the topic of power. When it comes to these issues that impact youth, oftentimes people will feel that youth don't have power or don't have the ability to really bring about change. But this conversation and so many other movements that have happened during the pandemic really show how wrong that is. Young people are just as capable of building, influencing, and experiencing power. For example, when we look at social media, although many youth have felt isolated from their friends in real life or people that they got support with from school and things like that, a lot of youth have turned to a lot of organizations that are based online. They've been getting into group chats, they've been contacting people that have similar experiences to them, and it's really helped them build a sense of community and feel like they're not alone. And now I guess we can transition into our guest speaker for today that I'm very excited about, Cameron. And they'll be talking more about their experiences with this issue specifically and talking more about civic engagement and young people and LGBTQ youth issues in general and how it's been impacted by the pandemic.
I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I just want to say hello to everyone. thank you so much for putting your time and effort into being here to better the community. And thank you so much to Arushi and Evelina for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. Let's get started.
All right, so first things first, Cameron, I was wondering if you could just talk more about your experiences with LGBTQ youth advocacy and your personal story, just to start things off and to give us some context before we go into some other topics.
So my LGBT journey has been a positive experience. I've been fortunate enough to have parents who are supportive of me. But however, many people do not have the same experience that I have. It's unfortunate that many people are not accepting, but it's really good to see that the people who are in environments that they can advocate, that they do choose to advocate and speak out against injustice. So I'm not going to get into the big details, but I identify as non-binary and asexual. But if you just ask me who I am, I'm just going to tell you that I'm just Cameron. I feel like labels are very restrictive and people are often trying to fit themselves into a box that was predefined from the start. I feel like each person is unique and they need to understand that they are who they are and they don't have to feel like they have to fit into one of these labels. So just keep that in mind. And along these lines comes gender norms and sexuality norms. These are very problematic because our society expects us to be heterosexual, cisgender, and sexually active. I've never understood why these expectations exist. And I've also not understood why this rigid system of gender and gender identity has to be defended so much. It feels like these people are saying if just a single person does not identify as cisgender or identifies as not straight, that the whole world's just going to collapse. One person could make a difference, but in this case, I don't think it's going to change the world for the worse. And this also doesn't really make sense because the number of LGBT identifying people in the world are increasing. In America, the Williams Institute found that 4.5% of people in America self-identify as LGBT, whether they're in the closet or they're out to their family and friends. So this is becoming so much more common. If you just take a group of 20 people, that's 1 in 20 people. But unfortunately, families and friends continue to be unaccepting. People aren't really supportive of these people, and they're breaking ties as friendships, and they are making their children homeless. It doesn't make sense, but the trends continue to have a rising number of LGBT people in the world, and we need to advocate and make sure that these people are able to have the rights and the respect that they deserve.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing. So, Evelina, you want to go ahead and ask the next question?
Sure. So how have you seen, or how do you think that the pandemic has impacted queer youth?
So with the pandemic, many people are now stuck at home, and at home they have, sometimes people have unsafe environments. They have families that aren't accepting, and they are constantly at home with these environments that are unsafe for them to be open about their sexuality or their gender identity. And with financial loss and insecurity during this pandemic, it's now even more likely for people to become homeless, just because of their identity. Because if their parents can't pay the bills and their parents are unaccepting, then I mean, it's more likely for this to happen, and that is really unfortunate. And along these lines, transgender homelessness is also an issue that is definitely important to acknowledge, because homeless shelters often separate by gender, and many of them deny transgender people from being admitted to these shelters, because you have two things. One is, oh, well, you identify as you identify as a gender that is the opposite of your sex, so then you are now not able to be in the shelter. And then you have the opposite on the other side with, oh, your sex is different than the one you're trying to apply for, and it's causing a problematic inability to allow these people to seek shelter, and it is not good in one bit. And so another issue is mental health during this pandemic. Now that people are stuck at home and businesses and services are being shut down, many people lack access to their mental health programs and services. And then oftentimes these are changed. Now they're on Zoom, or they're in a different environment that they're not used to. And this is causing problems, and people are now put into a different situation, and it's not the most ideal for them. And another reason why mental health is even more of an issue now is with the increased risk of suicide, with these untreated issues that they are facing, and then being at home with unsecured guns. This has increased the risk of suicide. A third of households, according to Giffords, that have children also have guns in their home. And 4.6 million of these children live in a home with unsecured guns. So that is a very large amount of people who, if a toddler accidentally finds a gun and fires it, that can be very deadly. And a teen or a child who can get access to these guns, they can unfortunately commit suicide. And we need to make sure that these guns are secured in their homes. So this has contributed to a rise in gun violence during the pandemic, and additionally, transgender murder. In 2019, the Human Rights Campaign reported that there were at least 27 deaths due to homicide because of their identity as transgender. And in 2020, from January to July, so that's just 7 months, there's already been 26 compared to 27 in the entire year of 2019. So we are on track of reaching even more than last year, and that is a big and shocking problem that we have to recognize. And then gun violence, we're also just in general on the track to reaching the worst year, which was previously 2019. And racism and LGBT issues intersect greatly with 10 times as much, a 10 times greater homicide rate against Black people than white people. That is just a terrible statistic from Everytown that just indicates that, just homicide and gun violence can just shatter communities, and it can be really terrible. So the social justice movement has stood up for marginalized communities, and it's great to see many people advocating against injustice. But unfortunately, it's also given a larger platform for people who have ignorant rhetoric and ignorant mindset to voice their thoughts. And we're seeing more people who used to be subtly racist are now being just blatantly bigoted. And now there's more violence, and just more just social discourse, and it's not good. So this is a lot of bad stuff. Not trying to make this all seem depressing, but it is real. But we have to work towards a world that this does not happen. The COVID-19 pandemic is not just going to go away with time. We can't just say, oh, in 3 months, everything's going to be fine. Well, you have to do something to prevent the continued spread, because it's not just going to go away with time. Science is real, so wear masks, stay at home to try to prevent the spread, and we can work towards a world where we don't have all these issues affecting our society. And then the misinformation now that is being spread on social media, it's created an infodemic with people just spreading things that are either misleading or just completely false. And there are many public figures who are trying to reinforce this and spread these false narratives, and it is really concerning. So just make sure that you check sources of stuff you're reading and make sure you aren't contributing to that.
So I also thank you for all that information, by the way. I also wanted to ask specifically, what social justice advocacy work have you been doing, since you did mention that you are involved with that? So during the pandemic, before, what kind of work were you specifically involved in, and how was that experience?
So I've been working on a lot during this pandemic, during the past 6 or 7 months. I've been working on digital social justice advocacy and digital civic engagement work, from organizing a month-long initiative called July the Vote, where I sent messages to people on Remind. I think there were more than 50 people that each day I sent them messages to educate them and foster action and dialogue on civic engagement. And many people got registered to vote and became student election clerks. Some great things, and that's also something that you should work towards, seeing if that can be something that you can do. And then I've also created a app called Plan to Vote, number 2, so you can create your voting plan in just 2 minutes with an interactive checklist that provides direct voting information and links. And I've also worked on a webinar series to uplift voices of marginalized communities. And we've put together, I think, almost 10 webinars during the summer. Me and a friend put that together, and it was really good. And it seems like a webinar like this is also really good, I've seen. And it's great that you're putting this together. And so now that we're in a digital world, it's more than important than ever to share your pronouns. We've shared our pronouns in our display names on Zoom here, and that is something that can be a great way to show that your support and indicate that you're an ally for transgender people. So during school, if you're doing that on Zoom or any other platform, that can definitely be something to try to normalize the sharing of pronouns and be there for other people. And this is also important just during a face-to-face introduction, not just on Zoom or social media bios. And then another thing that is really important is staying up to date on issues and current events regarding LGBT rights. Keep an eye on the legislation in Congress and keep an eye on the Supreme Court. Now that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has left the bench, LGBT rights are now more at stake than ever. We feel like same-sex marriage is something that we take for granted now, and that since we passed legislation or a court ruling that has secured a victory for same-sex marriage, but unfortunately, we haven't secured a victory. We have to continue fighting for it, because if the Supreme Court, that they could still overrule something and return back. Think about this. It wasn't until 2015 that federally same-sex marriage was legal. That's just 5 years ago. And we have to, it's not just a thing of the past, it's something of the present. And we don't just stop once we reach it. We have to keep going and continue to ensure that it can stay and that we're going to fight for the next step. So one of the Supreme Court picks that Donald Trump has chosen is Amy Coney Barrett. She was a potential nomination in 2018, and she was opposed by 26 LGBT rights organizations. And that is because she is a member of the People of Praise. It's a cult that enforces gender norms, and it separates men and women into head and handmaid. I don't know about you, but this sounds like something straight up from The Handmaid's Tale. And unfortunately, it's happening today. So we need to make sure that this person does not get into the Supreme Court. And we need to make sure that whoever does can stand up for LGBT rights. Education has failed us and is leading us to this dystopia. Education, for example, is not about memorizing that 12 million people died in the Holocaust. It's about understanding how the country allowed that to happen and and what we can do to prevent it from happening again. So you've probably seen on social media that Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, China, are now facing oppression, and the world is just letting it happen. And I think that something like this is just so big and such of a human rights concern that we can't just sit here like nothing's happening. And that's what happened in the Holocaust too. We just, people let it happen, and they were able to just go away with it because everyone was silent and just were convinced that it was something that needed to happen. So now that we have all our interactions on social media, speaking out against injustice is something that can keep the issues in the spotlight and make sure that issues like this cannot continue. But unfortunately, that's not really the case. It's created an echo chamber where people are just posting the same things over and over again, and then they're not doing anything about it. They feel like posting something is enough and that the issue is just going to solve itself. But we need tangible action. An example is with Breonna Taylor. The news today with Breonna Taylor's case, they indicted one of the officers involved in the incident, but they didn't indict them directly for that incident. And this is upsetting, not only just because the other officers were not indicted, but just that they aren't owning up to what happened. I'm gonna just explain shortly about what happened, because maybe you can break out of that echo chamber and understand a bit more about what's actually happening. So Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend were at their home in the middle of the night sleeping, and their door was barged open by police officers who were not wearing uniforms during a no-knock raid. So they were plain clothed, and they didn't knock on the door. They just barged right open because that's how the procedure goes. And so that's going to make a lot of noise, and it woke them up. So what are they going to think? Oh, it's a home invasion. Let me go get our gun, which is the #1 reason why people own guns, for a home invasion. And so they go to check out what happened, and seeing someone who's not in uniform, they don't know who they are, and they have a gun, their first response is to shoot at them because, I mean, that's what you do in a home invasion. And so that left Breonna Taylor dead and her boyfriend injured. And unfortunately, now they're being victimized and blamed for what happened. And all this outrage has been good because it's trying to speak up for her, because now she has no voice. But unfortunately, it hasn't led anywhere. And so some tangible actions to do is trying to advocate against qualified immunity to make sure that police officers are able to be correctly and justly charged for their actions. And then also reducing the use of force, making sure that a gun isn't just a person's first reaction. And a third way is with plainclothes no-knock raids. You shouldn't be supporting something like this where they're not in uniform. That is the reason why an incident like this occurred in the first place. So that's all I have to say about that. And I just hope that you can continue to speak up against issues like this, and that you can advocate for LGBT voices when they can't advocate for themselves. It's really important, and I hope that's what you can be inspired to do now.
Thank you so much for all of your points. I think they were very insightful. I completely agree that, queer voices, youth voices are very important during this time. Especially, I think you pointed out a good intersection of racial and queer voices coming together because, in this country, how you were mentioning that the system right now is unfortunately working against a lot of Black people in our country. And most often, the people who are most abused by the system are the Black, queer men, women, people. So I think that's very important for you to point out too. And I think that was a lot of good points. And that's something for everyone who's watching to remember that, your voice does matter. It doesn't matter if you feel that older people in power don't care about you. You make yourself heard. You go out there and make a change. And, that includes voting. That includes, making calls to your legislators, all that good stuff. You have to do it.
I kind of wanted to draw attention back to, LGBTQ youth during the pandemic specifically and how they've been impacted. We touched on this a little earlier before about how, LGBTQ youth are already at an increased risk for things like substance abuse, suicide, being homeless, and things like that. And I just wanted to open it up for anyone to share or kind of talk more about how you think the pandemic has truly impacted youth, talking more about personal stories and talking more about how, for me, for example, I've seen that the pandemic, although it has had negative impacts with, Spectrum, we have definitely had to transition to kind of trying to reach these youth online. And oftentimes that isn't a viable option because, sometimes youth don't have access to these resources. They don't have access to social media or internet. And it's really difficult to just reach out to people that need your help. So I wanted people, if you feel like sharing more about kind of what you've seen the pandemic do to queer youth and kind of what your experiences with that have been. And anyone else who feels like sharing can go ahead, type in the chat or unmute or whatever you feel comfortable with. This is a community conversation, so we want to make sure everyone's voice is heard, and anyone who feels comfortable sharing can go ahead and, add to the conversation.
Hi there, this is Andrew Fadius. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm a senior at Carleton College. First of all, y'all are doing really great, really amazing. I'm loving this conversation. But something I wanted to talk about, specifically regarding like LGBTQ youth and like the pandemic and how that kind of impacted me is, traditionally during the summers, I dedicate my time to volunteering and like activism and advocacy. Specifically, in Houston with like the Montrose Center, for example, for the past 4 or 5 years, I've gone to like the Houston Pride Parade and I volunteered. I've been on floats, and I think it's definitely been a really big game changer this year since a lot of those activities were no longer available. I wasn't able to volunteer and help out with galas and stuff that raise money and donations for a variety of foundations in Houston. And I feel like it's kind of, pushed queer youth to like find new spaces specifically online to connect. And I feel like, unfortunately, I haven't really been able to find them as much as I would like. So yeah, I guess like my kind of question here too is maybe trying to think of, and maybe y'all know of like ways that like queer youth can stay connected online during the pandemic. But at the same time, also being cognizant of, people's home and living situations, and also trying to understand the best way to bring people together, in a socially distanced way, but just also being cognizant of people's home lives.
So I definitely think, kind of tying into what Andrew just mentioned, I think that when it comes to really trying to find a community during a pandemic, I do think that it is really difficult sometimes, especially when you don't have access to these resources. You don't really have pre-existing connections. And Evelina can talk more about this whenever she speaks. But I was just thinking, I think a really great way is to just reach out to friends that you may have had before the pandemic that you knew in real life, whether it was, classmates or other people, and just asking them what they've been doing during the pandemic and kind of taking ideas from there. I know a lot of people are already really plugged in and really have connections with a lot of LGBT organizations and are kind of connected to this community and would definitely, be fine with letting you in and helping you find people that share the same experiences as you and kind of feel like you're not alone right now.
I completely agree. Even with my own experience, I find myself talking to people who I haven't even talked in years, but I know have shared a common experience with me, and being in a queer space and things like that, where it's like it's important to try and find those people, or at least like remember old connections, because it's incredibly important during this time, especially where the feeling of aloneness is something that's easy to catch. So I completely agree that finding either maybe any like social media page, and like I said earlier, like connecting with people who you already know are either safe for you to talk to, or also share a common experience with you, because it's those types of conversations and those types of connections that really help you mentally and just in your day-to-day life. And we encourage, again, like anyone else to speak up if you want to, or say anything in chat.
All right, just to maybe get the conversation started, unless someone wants to speak, I just wanted to really ask like a question, like maybe to get y'all thinking. What do you think life was like before the pandemic? And I know we've been asking this question repeatedly, but in terms of school, I think specifically has been kind of overlooked. How have things been different for queer youth who went to school, were part of clubs at school, or had friends or counselors or teachers at school that they could talk to? How do you think it's been different now that they're at home all the time, with online learning and maybe parents that they aren't out to or things like that? How do you think those experiences have been different? Like, what do you think about that?
For me personally, I'm like not out at home yet and stuff like that. So like it's kind of weird because like I'm used to like being myself really truly like around my friends. 'Cause, like we kind of have that like that relationship. So it's been like
All right, so I think there must have been some Wi-Fi issue there. That's totally fine. We can come back to it once everything turns out okay. But I guess I wanted to open it up to anyone else who wanted to talk about, how life has been before the pandemic in terms of school, online schooling, things like that, just how the environment has been different. And you can go ahead and share whether in the chat or unmuting.
Hi, I can talk next. So my name is Mandy. My pronouns are she, hers. I am a freshman at UT Austin. And first of all, I just want to like say, I also identify as asexual, but like more technically speaking, I identify as just like not like nothing really, because like anything can happen, and I don't want to like like box myself in. So I really appreciate, because I never like met someone else that like thought the same way. So that was cool. So in terms of how life was before and after the pandemic, personally, and also for a lot of my friends, especially my like LGBTQ plus friends, we've actually been more social during the pandemic. because like beforehand we only really like met each other in a school setting because we were like too busy to go out and stuff, and some of us could not go out, or like, you know, whatever the situation was. But now like we're all online, so like we've been FaceTiming more recently. Like we're in organizations together, so you know we meet through those organizations and like work hours and stuff when we just have like casual conversations. And I feel like that's been really, it's been like one, like in my personal experience, a beneficial thing about the pandemic, like just us learning how to interact with each other in an outside of school setting, which has like made our relationships stronger, because now we're more open and comfortable with talking to each other outside of just like, you know, helping each other in homework and stuff. And yeah, that's just my experience with the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I definitely think that's something that a lot of youth have seen, is that social media and just like connecting with people digitally has become a much bigger thing, because, you know, a lot of people aren't able to go out. Most people, you shouldn't be going out. Just have to kind of, you know, deal with just texting or calling or using social media. And it's a totally different experience than actually getting to meet people and talk about what's going on. I think adjusting to like FaceTiming people or like, you know, DMing them or being in group chats is a really different experience from how you could just, you know, ask someone if they want to hang out this weekend or go to some sort of group hangout and kind of feel like everyone's hearing you. I think that it's really different and kind of like, I think it's really cool how social media has really evolved to kind of fill the space that a lot of times this kind of connection with queer youth had to really play in people's lives. So I think that's a really unique point and really interesting one that you brought up.
Hey, this is Uyosa. I have a question. I use he, him pronouns. I am wondering, after Manny said that, yeah, that them and their friends have been really talking to each other even more during the pandemic, how um, you can expect or kind of like operationalize or like create a structure in which that is able to happen even, you know, post pandemic. You know what I mean? Like I'm wondering, how can we continue, especially in your case, Mandy, um, that ease of connection during one of the most like trivial times of human existence?
Hi again, it is I. So in terms of like continuing our connections and like, you know, making sure we don't fall out of touch after the pandemic, to be honest, like I think it's just been like, for this is, again, this is only my experience. I think personally, it's just like the amount of times that we've like talked to each other, interacted over these past few months, ever since like spring break until like now, has really like you know, I have gotten to know my friends. Like we stay up till like 4 a.m. just like talking about stupid things that do not matter. And I just feel like, I mean, I hope they feel the same way, but like I feel like we like just the amount of times that we've interacted with each other and stuff. Um like we've grown closer, and like hopefully we'll still be in touch post pandemic. And in terms of just like making sure the actual like process of reaching out to each other is easier, personally, we've been using we've been using Discord a lot for our org. Like all of us are in March for Lives Houston, so like we forced the executive director, who's like the person that like owns the Discord server, to like create a bunch of voice channels. So when like literally I see other people doing it too, because it's not just me. Like people will be like, hey, I need to talk to someone, and like, is anyone free right now to hop on the voice channel? And people would just like hop on and talk. And that's even happened like in an academic setting where people, which is like, it's really hard right now to be in school, because you can't really, like, especially if you don't already have friends, you can't ask people for help. And some people like, I don't know, they can't meet with the professor during office hours for some situation. People would literally just like type in like the biology Discord or whatever, like, hey, does anyone want to study together? And then 5 people will just hop on and like they'll become friends, and it's really cute to see. So I think that we've just all been finding ways to talk to each other, even outside of like in person, that I feel like it's going to remain and like stay. Like I can easily imagine myself and others staying in those like study group discords and like hopping on the voice channels whenever we need help instead of meeting up, because like in some ways it's easier than actually meeting up. So I hope that answers your question. I'm sorry if it doesn't. I ramble a lot.
I think that's really cool. I find that really interesting about like all the different school discords and stuff like that. For me personally, about like continuing social interaction, specifically with people who I've had to kind of like find connections with again. Like I said, like I recently have come in contact again with and like starting like real actual conversations again with a couple people who I haven't had that with in a while. So I think it's kind of just like realizing that during this time, like you said, like it is weird. Like this is so absurd to even imagine that like we're living through this. So I think just remembering that like I and everyone, if we try, like we have connections that are so vital and so important to our experiences. You know, during school, it was different for me where it's like if I wanted to talk about my own queer experience, I had like, I knew certain people who I needed to go to. And even if I didn't talk to them outside of school, it was like the one thing I had where it's like when I went to school and I had a certain thing I wanted to like ramble about my queer experience, I could go to them. So now it's like not having school in person, being able to like talk to people again and just finding new ways to be a better communicator. Because personally, I'm awful at communicating, and I think this pandemic is kind of like forcing people to relearn communication. So I think that's really important too.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that the pandemic has really, especially when it comes to marginalized groups such as LGBTQ youth, it's really forced people to think about new and better ways of communicating, because there are these so many new forms of communication and existing forms of communication that people are starting to use, you know, since we can't really communicate in person. So I guess that is like another topic to discuss, is how communication, especially for queer youth or for people who want to find a community and build a community, how that's kind of changed due to the pandemic, kind of forcing people to rethink how they interact with one another and how they really, you know, build bonds with one another, I guess. So if anyone wants to speak, once again, don't hesitate to unmute or type in the chat. So. Okay, so I see a question from Andrew. What advice would you provide to LGBTQ youth during the pandemic that are just starting out with self-discovery? If anyone wants to go ahead and answer that, otherwise I can, but anyone else, I invite you to answer. Okay, so Cameron, I was wondering, how would you feel about kind of sharing your personal experience and what advice you would have for queer youth who are kind of just starting out on their journey of finding themselves and figuring out who they are?
So I would say the journey, to take it easy. Definitely don't push yourself too far. Don't feel like you have to come out to people. And I would just also say, if you can, find and seek out people that you are able to talk to. Having connections with other people who identify as LGBT, or just having a friend who is supportive, can definitely be a great resource and just opportunity to kind of learn more about just the community as a whole and to learn more about yourself. I think that would be one of the number one ways.
Thank you so much, Cameron. So if nobody else has anything else to say, we're going to go ahead and just wrap things up and thank everyone for coming. We had some really interesting discussions about, kind of the evolving role of social media, how communication has changed, and the different challenges as well as innovations that queer youth have come up with during the pandemic and how it's really personally impacted us. So I want to go ahead and turn it over to Evelina or Cameron to just finish things off before we officially close our very first community conversation.
Sure, yeah. Just before I go into a little spiel, I just want to thank everyone who shared their stories and experiences. It's always great to hear fellow youth voices, especially queer voices. So that's been great. Just also beforehand, I think that Cameron had a really great point about finding people, especially during time of self-discovery, because sometimes it can be feeling like an isolating experience. And so while we're living in a very already inherently isolating time, I agree. Very important. Reach out to people. You never know really who. I mean, if you know someone who you can talk to about, you can probably have a great conversation. And yeah, so once again, just remember that during the time of this pandemic, queer youths are still important. We still matter, still here. Don't forget to remember that even for yourself, so that whenever you're interacting with the world, interacting with politics, interacting with the community, you are able to have power in yourself and remember that.
All right, Cameron, if you had anything to just wrap us off with before I just finish by providing us some quick resources that I'm going to be dropping in the chat in case any of you are in need of LGBTQ-friendly therapy, clinics, shelters, and just general resources. I'm going to drop some links in the chat. And yeah, so Cameron, you can go ahead and just give us a closing statement, and then we'll wrap things up for the end. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you so much for having me. And it was great to hear from everyone about their experiences. Definitely during a pandemic, it's great to hear from other people about their experiences and what we can do better to support each other. And so it's great to hear these voices.
All right, so thank you to everyone who tuned into today's community conversation, and there will definitely be more like this. So go ahead and follow Shift Press on virtually every form of social media, and we'll see you at the same time next week for a different conversation. So once again, thank you guys so much.
Yes,
All right,
thank
bye.
y'all.